Hello, can the people in the room hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, I know this might be a little bit strange for everyone in the seminar room because you probably can't see me right now, but I don't want to change the slides or anything, so I'm just going to do a quick introduction. But my name is Matthew Salcido. I was the guy running around setting things up right before things started. And we'd like to welcome you to our first in-person hybrid webinar seminar since COVID, at least for University Center. University Center is a program that's run by the Rainforest to help sponsor and guide entrepreneurs in the state of New Mexico. We offer things like this seminar that you're partaking in right now. We have one monthly, as well as an entrepreneurial capability certificate training program that this will soon become a part of, and also office hours and mentoring as needed. Today, we're going to be hearing from Ruba Sawaya and Rick Thomson on how to accelerate the regulatory clearance process. Rick has been started his career on Wall Street, and since then has moved through sales and marketing, found his way to medical device manufacturing and hospitals, and has a tenure over 30 years working in circuit board manufacturing, contract manufacturing, and medical device companies. He has launched products, companies, and new markets in the medical device space. And he's helped take med tech companies to $1 billion in revenue, concentrating in the $10 to $200 million range. Ruba has been a med tech executive with a 20-year track record of successful acquisitions and a history for delivering high-impact regulatory, clinical, and reimbursement programs, enabling market access and industry-leading positions. Former appointments include roles as the Executive Vice President of Clinical Affairs for Don Joy Orthopedics, multiple senior leadership positions within the Restorative Therapies Division at Medtronic, and an appointment as the G-Core Director at Orthofix. She is currently the Chief Executive Officer at Medistrat 360. And now I'll go ahead and turn things over to them.
Thanks so much, Matt. And welcome, everybody. Really excited to be here. This is a lot of fun. We've had several engaging conversations today, and we've got something. And so for this, we'll get underway here. And by the way, I'm Rick. This is Ruba. In case you're confused. Anyways, we get underway. We do want conversation, but we want to get through a lot of information. So we got about 45 minutes, so we'll pour through the slides. But as you go through the slides, jot down a note to ask, please to take us back to ask a question. And sorry for, a lot of times we like to do, questions along the way, but we want to cover a lot of really good material today. So we'll kind of hold off on that. And I'm going to dive right in. Okay, so Ruba and my background are different, but they mesh very, very well. And she and I worked together many years ago at a company out of Toronto. And Stacy, that's on my website too. So you can pull that off. No, it's great. I was going to say, we worked at a company. So what I would describe is that my experience started in business, started on Wall Street in finance, but the majority of it was with a large medical device company. And I worked through that entire company in all sorts of different roles. And so everything, business development, product development, reimbursement, all of those things, and got a really good cursory education in all those and worked in depth in a number of them. I left and I went into contract manufacturing, into high-tech electronics. I ran manufacturing firms and started doing turnarounds. And so a great deal of the work that I do these days is with turnarounds. But we're here today to talk about things so that you never have to get turned around because you start everything really good from the very beginning. And so a great deal of the work that I do is in the medical device world. Ruba, she's got the depth in regulatory, reimbursement, clinical trials, and all of that. She spent so much more time in these areas than I did. So, and because we've known each other so very long, we've combined. We both have our separate companies, but we work together quite a bit on projects. And we have a lot more to our team that we reach out to pull in for different things. But diving right into this slide, what it represents is that whenever we start talking to somebody, wherever they are in process, and it's usually pretty early on in cases like this, You tell people you're doing all the really good things. You got your head down, you're working on all these urgent issues, but you got to lift your head up. You've got to look at all this stuff. Because as soon as you go from idea to concept, and guess what? You need to be recording, you need to be in your quality system. You need to be looking down the road at where this is going to go and prepare for it. And so what this is meant to do is get you thinking about, you've got the concept and what market is it going to go into? Because that's going to guide the standards that you have to apply. It's going to guide which door you're going to go in at the FDA. And so, excuse me. And as I said, this is on my website at the R group, and it just takes you through. These are all things that you need to be thinking about. And some of them overlap into different areas. But when you start with, from an IP standpoint, you know what, I need to look at what else is out there. Well, then you need to start developing. Same thing with a quality system. But what happens is people will say, regulatory comes, I'm going to deal with that when I get there. Oh my goodness, you're already there. And you know what, we're going to figure out what standards we need to apply. If you don't do those things from the very beginning, and that's part of this accelerate thing that we're talking about, if you don't do them from the very beginning, you're backing up. So you get to a point where you've got to back up and change material. You get to a point where you've got to back up and figure out other testing routes. So, and I'm going to turn over to Ruba now.
So the second part, from my perspective, I've been working in MedTech for the last 20 years, and the work with Medtronic and Dondra Orthopedics especially really focused on due diligence, mergers and acquisitions, integrations, and commercialization of products. So part of the reason, after I took a very nice exit when we sold BJO to Innovis, that I started working with startups, is there had been so many in my career that we had come across that we ended up passing on because of key mistakes that were made very early from a development standpoint for them. And so for me, the opportunity to work with multiple companies that were young and driven and motivated and working on technologies that we believe could really make a difference captivated me. So for the last year and a half, I've been working with startups across the country, with a big concentration of them at Texas Medical Center. We have a huge accelerator set up there, and they have Johnson & Johnson has JLab set up there as well. That's been a key focus, and then partnering with Rick on occasion with some opportunities that are going on here in New Mexico. But that's a little bit about us and mission and culture, and part of the reason both of us decided to kind of set this up from that standpoint is that there is a need to recognize some of the requirements and providing a basic education on what the regulatory requirements from an FDA perspective are very early on, so that you don't get too far down the pipeline and end up delaying your clearances from that standpoint. Right?
I will also say along the way here, we'll explain a lot of things, but we'll also talk just some vignettes, some case studies that we'll talk about, and some that didn't turn out so well. Not that we were involved in those, and then some that we were involved that turned out really, really well. So, but we want to be able to say, hey, here's what happened. And anyway, just a little bit, just as far as the two of us working together. So I advise companies and to focus on all, as we've said, to focus on all the steps all the way through development and to assist them in implementing steps, processes, and teams. They're going to ask, so you're a consultant? I'm not. What I do is I come in and I work with the internal team to figure out what are the things we need to do to build this, what resources do we need to reach out to, and then how do we move this thing forward? And at some point when things are going really, really well, people look around and I slipped out the back door and I'm not there anymore. It's my favorite thing to do because the team is functioning so very, very well. Ruba, hers is to enable and accelerate access to disruptive innovation that transforms the lives of patients. We both love working with disruptive things. So we love work. I'm sorry.
We have to love fancy marketing people. We work on strategy, crisis management, remediation, gap analysis, and finding ways to cut your timelines so that you can get to clearances faster. So that to me is kind of the element. Not a fluffy pitch from a straight up person. Fair enough.
When you do all these things early on and you really concentrate on you look up and look way down the road, build those things in early on. And oh my goodness, you get to move things so much quicker when you do that.
So our shared objective really today is to bring you a step closer to your device goals. Can we go to the next one? With strategies across 4 key areas: R&D, regulatory, clinical evidence, and reimbursement. And then key strategic considerations. If you are at a point where you're trying to raise funds or trying to seek investors, key questions that you need to be able to address and answer.
And I have to read the silly little joke because it is, but the new system is taking way too long to develop. How can we expedite the process? Well, if you're willing to risk a little prison time, we could skip some regulatory requirements. That's me on the right usually saying that. And I literally have said a meeting where people go, where they say, so can you help us? No, that would be illegal.
So diving right in with that fun comment, can you go to the next one, please? So most common thing that I come across with startups is a hyper focus at 90 miles an hour for that ideation phase, with this wrong assumption, quite frankly, that we don't have to worry about design controls or compliance with design controls. Hey, Ruba, we're just prototyping. We're not messing with that yet from a regulatory submission strategy perspective. So we're not going to implement any quality management system requirements, and we're not going to implement any design control requirements until we get further down the line. And 2 key basic pieces of information that I want to impart today specific to that quality management system. Every device, regardless of what classification it is, whether it's a class 1 or a class 2 or class 3, you're obligated to create documentation even early in design as part of the product development process. And where this hurts you is by the time you end up with iteration version 3.0, you've picked up key reasons why you wanted to change it between the first one and the second one and the third one. And when you're sitting in front of FDA and they ask a question that you picked up on phase 2.0, you don't have the documentation to prove to them that they will accept that change fixed the issue or the problem or the risk that they're concerned about. So that ends up with delays because you're going back and redoing testing when you've already done it. And all you had to have done is just to keep the basic documentation from the get-go. So that to me is the #1 suggestion, is to kind of pop that bubble that says design controls are a framework and the quality management system is a framework that FDA provides. And if you decide to follow it from the beginning, you subsequently end up with higher quality devices, and you end up with the right documentation that keeps you from being delayed later when you do go to submit. So that's one. So design, can you go to the next slide? Rick, did you have a couple of examples that had that on the bottom specific to that one?
I have one, and it ties in as a. I was asked to help. Somebody reached out to me and said, power. I've done a lot with micro power with companies, and so this goes more to the manufacturing side of things I've done. And it was they need help with the battery design. I said, can you talk to them? And I did. And when we first started talking, I said, all right, so tell me a little bit. Well, they had all class 1 devices. Okay, great. And they wanted to add power to one of their class 1 devices. I said, okay, why? It'll work better. Okay, we're already past the design controls and quality system. It'll work better. Okay, that's great. So what's the basis of that? Well, we know it. We know a guy who said that it's going to work better. Clinician said it's going to work better. Better towards what? What's it going to accomplish better? Why are you asking? Because FDA is going to ask. What have they got to do with it? Have you all ever done a class 2 device before? No, this isn't going to be a class 2 device. We're just adding power to one of our class 1 devices. Yeah, they just made it a class 2 device because of its use case. And so they didn't believe so. And the conversation I have early on, so much of the time was, so I'm in there for a battery, and now all of a sudden I'm going, okay, we've got some issues here we need to track through first. But I said, what did the guidance documents from the FDA talk to you about? And they said, what's that? Okay. So let's grab the guidance documents that apply to this. Let's get one of our additional regulatory people on the phone. So we did a meeting and we had them go through the guidance document. And within about an hour, the president said, you guys realize this is a class 2, right? Thank you. Yes. And so now we're headed down the road. And as we did that, one of the next phases was, they still wanted to do it. It was going to be a class 2, which is less scary if you're doing all these things right. It doesn't have to be a long road through. But one of the first things I said was, let's talk about your quality system. Is it robust enough to handle this? And they said, yeah, absolutely. Can I take a look at it? And you know the answer. It actually was a good quality system, but it didn't have the design controls built in. It didn't have the steps and the reviews built in. And it really wasn't that expensive to have pulled in one of the quality people. And it wasn't that expensive for them to update all of that. So it had those steps in it that the FDA is going to be asking about. So simple thing, I get pulled into these projects where it's a pretty simple, can you help us add a battery? But there's a bunch more that needed to be going on. And it usually falls to what's this regulatory road we're going down? What are this also what are the standards we need to be building into this, because now this thing's got battery power to it. And so it changes a lot of things, but you really have to say, is our quality system robust enough? Are we keeping the right records from the get-go?
That was perfect. And this is what's interesting. The warning letter on the right-hand side, you have a startup company that actually got 510K clearance on their device. They submitted the appropriate documentation. They got the basic testing done. Device is out on the market for 6 weeks, and they ended up with a massive number of complications that got reported. FDA showed up to do an audit, and they didn't have half of the existing design control documentation that they were supposed to be generating as part of following that product development process from FDA, and they were issued a warning letter. When you think about what this does from a press releases perspective and what it does to your investor funding, I've lost count of the number of startups that have died early because of something like this from that standpoint. They got clearance. They checked the basic boxes, but didn't follow the product development requirement or the documentation. So just as a real world example for why this is incredibly important to really implement those as early as you can. And to Rick's point, it doesn't have to be a super complex system. It doesn't have to be 600 standard operating procedures and 600 protocols. There are good guidances from FDA on their website for setting up really simple processes and SOPs and procedures to enable you to be compliant with these requirements. But it really is important that you start it as early as possible versus waiting until later on in the development process. Yes.
I get asked every single time, so what's the best quality system? The one you use. And I don't care if it's spreadsheets, use it. And so the best quality system is the one you use. The worst one is the most expensive one that has stuff you'll never use. So don't use that one. And so when they say, oh my gosh, this will cover anything and everything that you'll never want to do, you guys are so busy doing what you need to do. You don't have a month to take off for orientation for everybody to learn the new quality system. Use what you've got, find out what you need to do to beef it up. And if you need to do more, there's some really simplistic, great cloud-based ones that build in by module of where you are in stage. So look at those. Okay.
Yes, and again, at the source of it, does somebody have a question? Sorry, somebody does not have a question. The sole reason FDA does want you following this process is that if you look at the statistics, design issues are the largest source of product recalls in the United States. The #1 reason. And so this process may increase the burden and it may take you a lot longer or a little bit longer. But subsequently, what you end up with, because of the fact that you're following it, is higher quality devices from the get-go. It's important with a group of folks that's really committed to patients and patient care and technologies that want to transform, recognizing that by default of you making a decision that you're going to follow that process from the beginning, you're going to end up producing higher quality devices for those patients. So I'm gonna get off my my box on preaching on that one. Can we go to the next slide? Does anybody have any questions before we move on design controls or product development for the sake of creating opportunities throughout? How many of you have implemented design controls today, out of curiosity? Okay.
Yeah, I've done it before, but not in the current venture. Yeah.
Other key high-level suggestion is developing that market access strategy early on so that you can figure out if you're going to have to implement these design controls and these SOPs, looking at what your biggest markets are going to be from the get-go. Reason being, in certain cases, you can design those to meet the requirements not only for the US, but the requirements for a couple of global markets at the same time. So great example is US and EU MDR. So the European Union went through and made major revisions to their requirements for device clearances. A lot of companies got really smart about going through and modifying their existing product development processes to incorporate the EU requirements. And subsequently, what happens is that when you go to get your EU clearance, your US clearance, your EU clearance happens shortly thereafter. And again, investor opportunity, your ability to put out press releases that, you know, announce that you have US clearance and then a couple of months later an EU clearance rides really big. The revenue generation in parallel, and you're optimizing your existing process. So it may not be that much of it's not that much of an increase in the initial investment. It's about being smart enough to design that process the right way from the beginning. And Rick, I think you had an example for that one, right? Yeah, the company evaluation goes up too from that perspective.
Yeah, that's something to keep in mind on all this. Tracking along beside this parallel is raising funds. And I've said on so very many panels where I ask very simple questions early on of, man, that's great. Who's asking for this? What? And it's a really great idea. No, it's a wonderful idea. Who's asking for it? And folks to know that. How will they use it? So there's all these things that investors all the way through here will be asking, and the stakes keep getting higher and higher the more money that you're asking for, and the more things that you have in place, the better you are. So when she asked about an example, there was a particular company that I got involved with, and it took a lot of people involved in this, but it had multiple components. It was a very complicated project. It had a power aspect to it, and a very, very high-tech, a totally new design system for power. It had a power aspect. It had a disposable aspect. It had a controlling aspect. It had some clinical tie-in pieces as well. But each of those had their own, you had to look at it as each of those and holistically. So each of those had their own standards. Each of them had their own path, each of the components. Each of them had their own tests that they were going to go through. And then you also had to be looking at that from a systems standpoint. And so you had to be watching all of, and when I said, look at the end users, well, the end user is going to be used for trauma care. Great. Which environments? Pre-hospital. Okay, which environments? And so as you keep stepping through that, you're going, will it be used in an ambulance? Yeah. And what about rescue helicopter? Yeah, I guess it could be. Okay. And everybody, the vibration of a helicopter and all that, that's tough. That's tough to make it through test. It's not the worst. The turboprop is. And so there are certain systems that unless your device, certain systems, military, certain EMS, unless your device can go in all vehicles, being turboprop, plane, helicopter, all of those, unless it can go into all of those, it doesn't get to go in any of those. And so the difference being that in building it, in this particular project, we had to determine what the tests were, the shake, rattle, and roll test. If it's going to go out into those environments, it changed the IP rating that we had to go through. IP rating being dust ingress and water ingress. And so as it went into different environments, as it gets dropped into a puddle of water, gets dropped into snow, is taken up, it changes all of that. And you've got to know that and build it in from the very, very beginning. And in that particular case, the other was, you guys going to take it international? We'll worry about that later. Okay, because the plastics that are approved right now that you're using are not acceptable under CE mark right now. Whoops. How much will it cost to change them? Hardly anything. Just, you've got to look at, and you go, well, we're not worried about, that's okay. The investors are. The investors are going to want to know if this thing can go international and what that means. And so it's looking at this thing, each of these components and everything holistically, and what are all the tests, what are all the standards that have to be built in? Really looking down the road, and look at that really early on, please.
Awesome. So I think next slide. So transitioning over to regulatory, and again, each of these sections is structured with here's a high level overview of the basics to educate, and then opportunities to accelerate, and then real world examples of things to do and things not to do. Fair enough. So the way that FDA classifies devices is based on three things. You have the intended use for that device, the indications for use, and then a determination of the device risks based on the first, based on intended use and based on indications for use. That device risk designation, they take those three things and make a decision based on what your product category is and your risk profile, that device falls into a specific classification. The higher the classification, the more significant the regulatory burden, the more significant the compliance burden, the more evidence you have to submit to them for safety and efficacy. And just as an example of how important it is to get regulatory support and guidance early on, if somebody put together a submission where they outlined that the indication is a scalpel, it's a blade, and it's meant to cut soft tissue, that ends up going into a class 1 designation with a really low burden. If somebody wrote it up because he's a neurologist or he's an optometrist, that they've designed a scalpel that they're planning on using for eye surgeries, it just went to a class 3 PMA. So taking the time to have conversations with folks that have some regulatory background to say, listen, this is my background and this is my goal with this device, but what is the best way to set the clearance pathway for that device can really be transformational for your ability to get on the market quicker and then work out a pathway. So that optometrist still can go after eye surgeries, but the intent is that we provide him strategy, guidance, and input where he gets that initial clearance first and then goes after the next piece, versus making the mistake, and this is a real example that we've dealt with a different technology, where they're writing it from their perspective and they're writing it from their expertise, not recognizing the implications of how that will communicate to the regulatory groups at FDA. So those are the three things that determine that risk profile. FDA decides based on that risk profile and your intended use, you're falling into these classes. The other thing that's important is that you have to give them information about what population you're targeting. So within that indications for use, I'm coming up with a bariatric pull that's going to pull up. What are the max threshold that it can take for those patients? What are the patient ages for that diagnostic device that you're working out? You're going to be required to think about the populations for which this device will work, and the populations where it won't, and define that clearly for them, and then prove that within the performance testing that you end up doing from a clinical perspective. Just to give you some high level stats, basically. So class 1 devices are the lowest classes. 43% of them are subject to general controls. Class 2s are about half of all devices, and those are subject to special controls. And then there are over 1,870 device categories. So when you think about, again, bringing in some folks to help provide some clarity on which are the best options for how to position your intended use and your device classifications, where you end up with an accelerated clearance, it really does help and is invaluable to get that input as early as possible. And literally when we come in, we'll lay out the different options. It's a conversation that says, option A is for you to go after general clearance. Here are the pros and cons. Here are the markets and the companies that will be more interested in you if you do that. Option B is to go after a more specific indication. Here are the trade-offs of taking that approach, and depending on the circumstances from a market standpoint, in certain cases, B, the therapeutic one might be a better option. And I'll talk to an example of that later on in the deck. Rick, perfect. And here's what happens on the opposite end of that for risks that occur. So I love this one because in this case, you had a company where the device was approved for a specific indication. The doc decided to use, wait, hang on, which one is this one? This one, they had a clearance, they had an FDA clearance for a specific indication. They were selling the product for a completely different indication, working on the default assumption that because they had FDA approval, they were good to go. And so this is another piece, we're not having that regulatory expertise in-house to say, hey, we're not allowed to sell that laser to be used for eye surgeries. It's cleared for a very general clearance, and we just did something illegal from that perspective. I thought you had an example.
No, I can talk about a couple of things. The other I'd like to say is when I have conversations, people say, oh my gosh, regulatory. It's a set of rules, but the other part of it is that when it costs all of, okay, for a class 1 device, not so much. For a class 2, yeah, a little more. So as you go up in stages, the costs get more, but you don't necessarily. If you're working with a firm that says you're going to be all in and pay us everything up for all of that, you're with the wrong folks. Find regulatory groups, firms, whatever. We're happy to work that way. Find that we'll say, you know what, if you engage us for an hour a week, for 2 hours a month, what it is, please allow us to give you some accountability and some guidance. And let's start plugging in these things in, right? And when she said there was I got a panic call within the last, I don't know, year. I got a panic call of Rick, we've been pulled from the market. Okay, tell me what that means. And well, we got a letter, we're off the market, all our products are off the market. Okay, so what is it? So we start looking into it a little bit. And so what it was is they had been cleared under a special dispensation to begin marketing what they had. And with the understanding that they had to go back and complete their entire track through the FDA. They didn't. They got really busy. And it happens. They got very, very busy and they're moving along. And now the FDA said, you know what, you were supposed to have done this. It's over. So they stopped them. And what we did is immediately went back and looked at exactly what the guidance was for that. It took a little digging. We found out what the guidance was for it. We also had a conversation with the FDA. They're actually pretty good about that. There are particular individuals that you can reach in different departments. And I do have the conversation where somebody goes, yeah, really nice. And so anyway, we had the conversation, got a little bit more guidance. And the next part of it was we needed to go back and get some additional testing done. And this is another lesson learned. Different labs that I've worked with around the country for things. I called the first one. Oh my gosh, we're so busy right now. Yeah, we can dig in. We really haven't done this, and we can dig into it. We're going to start. It's going to be $110,000 for this test. And we're busy. And anyway, had a couple more calls similar, and they hadn't even been doing this particular area. I reached out to one that I should have reached out to begin with, and I said, oh no, we've done 3 of these in the last year, and yeah, we can take it'll be about $11,000. So, oh my gosh, get some other estimates for the things you're working on, please. And this one, not only had they done 3 of them, they had the exact protocols to get it done. They had it done in no time, and we were able to get them back on the market very quickly. So dig into those things, find people that understand that. So
the other reason it's kind of important to do that at the beginning is that you go through and you figure out these different options for you from a regulatory perspective. Depending on which one you land on is the best option, you end up with information about we're going to be in this our device is going to fit under this product code. That product code comes with specific controls applied by FDA and specific requirements. So it gives you like a roadmap for what testing you have to do, what biocompatibility requirements you have to fulfill, what human factors testing you have to consider as part of your clinical trials. If you do that early, you save a whole lot of time. Most people don't. They go through and do all of this testing. Then they go have the conversation with FDA and realize that they're missing half of the testing that they needed for that specific product code.
Or they doubled up on ones they didn't even name,
Exactly right. So,
which goes to predicate devices.
yeah,
And if you know where you're headed and is there competition, yeah, there's one similar, but we're better. I trust that. But if you go pull the records for that predicate device and they're public, you can find out what were the standards they had to apply. What was the testing they had to have done? And it gives you a really good roadmap for what you need to be doing. Go ahead and have the additional conversation with the FDA and all of those things, but go pull the records of who went there before you.
key things that matter on substantial equivalence. A lot of the folks I talked to this morning make comments along the lines of, there's already a device that we're thinking about using for substantial equivalence. If you laid out a table and had the first column that said, we know we're in this product code and these are the requirements from FDA, here's our characteristic for our device, and here's our competitors. In cases where there are key differences, because this is an area where I see a lot of people run into issues with FDA, is, hey, our mechanism is slightly different, but the plastic is the same and it's doing the exact same thing and it's intended for the exact same population. If that change that you have made in the product, whether yours is larger or smaller or thinner, and from FDA's perspective, you have to prove to them that that difference isn't introducing a significant impact on the safety profile of that device or the effectiveness of that device. So substantial equivalence is a great strategy because it's faster, right? You go to FDA and say, hey, there's one that's already cleared. We do the exact same thing. Our intended use is the same. Our indications for use is the same. But ours is improved in the following ways. Awesome. Be very careful about how improved in the following ways is defined, and make sure that you are thinking about what safety risks they may bring up and that you've done the testing to prove that that's not an issue, whatever it may be. That's one that screws a lot of people on.
When you're going to the FDA, rule of thumb is we're just like them. And yeah, we're just like them. When you do your IP work, you go, we are so totally different. And so totally different. But when you're doing the FDA, we're going, yeah, we're just the same. And that's okay.
Well, and it's interesting. You know where I see this come up is that people are proud, and rightly so, of the innovation they've come up with. So a lot of the time when we review submissions for folks where they decided to write a submission themselves, where we tend to bleed all over it is it's coming across as too innovative. And that sounds bad, but raising concerns that because it is cutting edge, because it's breakthrough, because it's so different than whatever's before, and does it really qualify under substantial equivalence? And then two, are you introducing or raising issues for FDA on safety?
Know your audience.
Know your audience. Yeah, from that perspective, at 100%. The other thing that is important is to his story about promotional claims. Can you go back for a sec?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's okay, too fast.
Oh,
One more.
I was trying to move this along. Is that it?
No, it hates you.
What?
It's the promotional claims. It's the promotional claims one right here.
Sorry.
So words matter. What you put on your website matters. If you're looking at a device that is very early in development and you're promoting it because you're trying to get investors, positioning it as future development is awesome. Positioning it as something that we've currently got, that we are selling and testing, will get you killed from a warning letter perspective. So be careful about how you position some of these promotions when you're trying to recruit investors and others, because if FDA comes across it, you put yourself at risk for a warning letter. If you are selling it when you don't have approval and you're a device manufacturer and has been listed as a device manufacturer.
I met with someone a while back, and we started talking about what they've developed. And we're in agreement, it's a class 2, yes. And so we talked through some things, and he said, we need to start on prototyping for our next version. I went, okay, so what are you doing with the first version? We're selling that to surgery, so we're freestanding clinics, surgery centers. Okay. You have any clearance yet? And no, we're headed for the hospital market, but that's where the clearance is necessary. Oh, really? And since we're selling it in freestanding clinic, and I went, is the use case the same? Yeah, same. Rick, you don't understand. Hospitals are what require the FDA clearances. If you're doing them in freestanding places, it's totally different. The environment's what's different. I went, wow, okay. That's actually not true. It's the use case that carries it, not the environment. And so in a case like that, in a case like that, it's not a matter of if they get caught. They will get caught because at a point in time as they continue to advance, if they don't, and they're advertising it on a website, and you really can't do that. And promoting it on a website for here's what it does and buy it from its surgery centers and freestanding clinics. But at a point in time where they're audited, the FDA will audit them at some point. They do everyone. And they'll look back through all of the records. You pull a string and you trace back through that string and look at all of these things. At a point in time when they have to get their 1345 certification, the auditor will come in and will go back through all of this and find you were selling this. It's not just a warning letter. When you're at an early stage like this, it's the end of your company. And it's just not worth it. Their big thing was, we can start producing revenue early. The investors will love that. And not when they lose every dime, and the investors are going to figure it out. So.
That's great. Next one. That's really your take home message is that key takeaway for that regulatory section is get regulatory guidance early in the development process. Noting that those inputs will have an impact on the testing plans that you're going to execute against, and that getting that input can significantly accelerate your timeline to market because of the opportunity for us to offer really creative strategic options that are fully compliant with the FDA regs. We're not doing anything illegal. Can you go to the next one?
Yep.
So this is the example that I was talking about earlier, where literally you have someone that is working in epilepsy that developed a laser that could be used for treating epileptic lesions. And there's a couple of different options for how to pursue this indication, right? You can go to FDA and say, we're a laser and we want approval to ablate soft tissue. The company can't promote for epilepsy, they can't market for epilepsy, but they secured the 510(k) clearance in under 2 years because the testing for that is pretty basic and it's pretty straightforward. They started generating revenue because they can promote that device for that ablation, and they were working in parallel. We did an indication expansion with another 510(k) 12 months later. So now it went from they have ablation of soft tissue to ablation of abnormal brain tissue, and then they got acquired by Medtronic. Medtronic doubled down and spent a large amount of money, let's go with that, for getting that epilepsy indication, and it took another 6 years to do that. Second company, they went directly to therapeutic from the get-go. The guy refused to budge from the fact that they wanted to develop it specific to epilepsy from the beginning. They kept promoting and marketing the product on the website. They got a warning letter and they lost their funding. They didn't make it. So case in point example of why it really is incredibly important, and it offers such a phenomenal opportunity to A, keep you out of trouble, and B, keeping in mind kind of what the bigger corporate entities are looking for. We recognize that you want to get to revenue generation as fast as possible, giving you good ideas for how to do that quickly while still staying compliant so that you can stay active as a company. You don't end up getting killed. That's it on that one. 75% of 510(k)s are rejected on first submission to FDA, and 83% of PMAs are rejected on first submission to FDA. Another phenomenal statistic to highlight why it's worth taking the time on the front end to get that regulatory input and guidance so that you're not burning money. Rick?
Earlier, when I talked about the company, there was the multiple components. So there was the power, the control, and all of that. That particular company, multidisciplinary team that met every week. Everybody was accountable off of each other. Every bit of that, we had the roadmap and we followed it. We project planned that thing like crazy. And all the testing, everything was done and followed. And it's not to say there weren't any glitches along the way, but what we had was backup plans. And then we had backup plans to the backup plans. And then guess what? Backup plans to those. And so we made it through in one cycle with an extremely complicated device. And it's because we were so intent on detailing out everything we were doing. And that's how you get through in one cycle is just staying ahead of the curve and planning it all out and staying on that roadmap, being accountable with the team. So
the other really interesting opportunity that's worth considering for all of you is around pursuing breakthrough device designation. So this is a program at FDA that says that if you have a device that you've come up with that is more effective than what's currently out there, it's breakthrough. It really is disruptive and new innovation. There's nothing else like that out there. And there are no alternatives on the market. You apply for breakthrough designation with FDA, explaining the technology and showing how you meet this criteria, and they grant you this designation. The neat thing about this designation is that it enables you to set up sprint meetings with FDA, where we're early in R&D design, and we want to get input from FDA for the testing strategy that we're thinking about. It's not that you get to skip the line, but you get to skip the line. Within 30 days, they get you a response and they get you on the calendar to be able to provide you that input and that feedback, whether it's tied to R&D development, it's tied to clinical trials, through that sprint request process within the breakthrough designation. The other really neat thing is that November 22 last year, can you go to the next one, Rick? FDA updated, revised this pathway process to incorporate and include technologies that focus on healthcare disparities and populations that have healthcare disparities within the system, with a desire to want to reduce barriers to health equity. So, and to me, where this opens up a nice door is elderly population, the obese population, African Americans, areas where there are clear healthcare disparities that have been documented. And you've got a technology that helps to address or enable that. You know, digital is a great example for folks that are remote, that don't have access to care, where people are coming up with digital apps that enable engagement or intervention, is a good example where this can be applied. So that dropped November 2022. It's a nice opportunity to also take your technology and evaluate whether it's worth applying for that designation. The press releases are phenomenal from an investor perspective. Look at it nodding, right? It makes a big difference. They love to see that. You can earn a lot of PR and positive attention. And then again, the side benefit is the ability to get really solicit quick feedback from FDA along the different stages of the product development lifecycle.
and by the way, she said apply for it, but that can include having conversation with them and saying, here's what I'm thinking, and they can say, no, that's not really breakthrough, or yeah, go ahead and file it. Let's take a look at it. So have the conversations or get with people who know how to.
Yeah, so I'm going to speed it up a little bit because I know we're running behind. Skipping to clinical, going to the SOP slide, Rick. So where does clinical fit in? This is, you're going to see this slide until you're blue in the face. This is FDA's design process with the different requirements lined up. Clinical is all about validating performance of your device. In certain cases, depending on the classification, you don't end up having to do a clinical study. You have performance that gets proven from a biocompatibility or a testing standpoint, and you're good to go. A big chunk of the time, that's not the case, and you have to do clinical studies. The clinical trials within FDA are very heavily regulated. Next slide. This is just a snapshot of some of the requirements that you're supposed to hit. And I bring this up why? Because each institution, each healthcare facility operates for GCP. You guys have an IRB, you get approval, which is totally awesome. You run your studies the way that you're supposed to. The issue people don't realize is that the FDA requirements, when you want to use that data to submit for clearance, is 10 times the documentation that you currently have for running any of your clinical studies within your institutions. So this is another watch out for folks, is to be really good about recognizing that if your plan is to generate clinical data, you want to make sure that you are taking the time to meet with somebody who knows what the regulatory requirements are beyond whatever it is that you're doing at your institution to get that documentation. And source data verification is a great example of that. Like if you're running a clinical study to get a PMA cleared, we're required to have quality plans in place that say we verify the data and ensure that we're doing regular checks for specific data that's important to that study. You don't have to do that when you're running a clinical study within your institution. You can't get the approval from FDA for an IDE product or that study without having us having collected it from a med device perspective. Next slide. So this is another great example with a physician who started an investigator-initiated trial. Device is approved for indication X. He started using it for indication Y. He got approval from his IRB. They still ended up with a warning letter because that device is deemed significant risk by FDA for that new indication that they were using it for. And FDA requires them to go get an IDE approved from them. So this is another one that happens more often than you think, because folks assume, well, it's FDA approved. I'm using an FDA approved product to do the study. They get approval from their IRB, but it turns out that that new indication he's using it for, according to FDA, is significant risk. According to FDA, that puts it in a class 3 designation, and it requires him to go get way more approvals from FDA before you can start recruiting a single patient. Takeaways: seek guidance on FDA performance requirements prior to any studies to make sure that you're complying with the required standards. This applies to clinical trials as well as feasibility testing early in the development process, and we talked about that earlier. The benefit to that is if you're like, hey, guys, here's the testing that we're thinking about for this device submission, we can give you advice to say, hey, this and this is going to come up, and you may want to think about incorporating it because yours is slightly different in the following ways from that predicate that you printed off the internet. Because that's the easiest thing to do, right? You pull the predicate. People don't realize that there are certain things that we'll see from that standpoint that are going to raise FDA concerns based on our experience with having dealt with them that you may not see having looked at what's online for that previous submission. The other piece that's really important to step back and really think about is that the healthcare expenses in the US are going to quadruple because of that elderly population. And what's happening subsequently is that you have a system that's shifting from fee-for-service to value-based healthcare. It's changed the game for medical device companies from the standpoint that in the past, there was a hyper focus on just getting that FDA clearance, and we've shifted to where we have to be able to prove that we have an impact across multiple stakeholders, not just getting that FDA approval, or we don't make it from a market standpoint. And so what that means is really, if you're going to make that investment to generate the evidence, taking the time to think about what your value case looks like beyond the clearance. And what happens if you don't end up doing that is what happened. And I think, Mark, I've used that example with J&J, right? So they bought the Charité disc from a company out in Germany. They paid $30 million for a PMA to get clearance of this disc regeneration device in the US. They did not look at the reimbursement requirements and the endpoints that would matter from that perspective. And they positioned it with a higher cost when it got the clearance than the existing standard of care. Their clinical trial person that designed that study set up that product for substantial equivalence, to be like that the outcomes they were going to get with that device were going to be equivalent to what was already on the market, which is great if you're a clinical person. You've set up yourself for success. They didn't take a good look at the big picture and incorporate additional outcomes that would matter to the payers. So if you're going to try to charge twice as much for that device and make claims that you're better, you've incorporated additional parameters that matter to the payers. So you know, clearance does not equal reimbursement. I can't emphasize that enough. and taking the time to really think about these pieces up front matters. Why? Because when that clinical person designed that study, if you had somebody on the reimbursement side sitting at the table, they would have asked her to incorporate economic endpoints. They would have asked her to collect information on the payers for those patients. And then all of a sudden on the back end, you end up with evidence portfolios that get you the clearance, economic publications, health economic outcomes research. So it becomes a stream of evidence that supports the value proposition for that device, and that addresses not just the regulatory requirements, regulatory, payer, healthcare administrators. It's the game has changed from that perspective, and winning in medtech is taking that under consideration. And having sat on M&A teams for the last 8 years with 2 top 10 companies, people that do this, the valuation and what we agree to pay is triple what it is for people who don't, because they have better market adoption. They've already set themselves up for success from that perspective. You differentiate yourself from the other companies that are also trying to get deals.
We're gonna bring it to a close.
Can you go? So this we've already talked about, thinking about the regulatory clearance. I think that's pretty much it. Real world evidence pathway. This is another opportunity for indication. So for folks that have existing devices where you're looking at expanding or pursuing a new indication, it's worth Googling real world pathway FDA. They have some really great articles to read up on this for that opportunity. You can take some shortcuts by using evidence. Where does this sound from your competitors? Or expanding your own indication for an existing device that's already approved. Keep going. Strategic considerations. I think we're out of time, other than to say, kind of the key parameters that are looked for when people are trying to buy a company. Everybody thinks their device is changing the game. Be good about really focusing on how you tell that story against the existing standard of care. And no matter how innovative it is, there is an existing standard of care. Right now, they're doing X with those patients, or they're doing nothing. When they're doing nothing, how are those, is it 10% of the patients that end up needing your device, or is it 5%? Everybody always walks into these pitch meetings with there's a $40 million market here, and there are 20 million patients that have heart attacks a year. Great. The standard of care treatment options that currently exist cost X, and they bring the following benefits. Be good about thinking ahead on how you're going to position yourself against that market and against those dynamics so that you can differentiate and get the investment money that you need. Rick?
No, we're just gonna do takeaways.
And then key takeaways. The only other one that I refuse to skip, I don't care if we're out of time, is cognitive bias. Can you go to the top 7? So reasons companies fail from a startup perspective more often than not is these are the top 7 biases that all of you as entrepreneurs and startups are up against. And these are blind spots that you carry that you don't realize that you carry, right? We don't have time to cover them. The reference is at the bottom of the article. I will make sure Matt emails the hyperlink, but I strongly encourage all of you to really read the different biases that you're susceptible to as an entrepreneur, and to be actively aware and looking for them so that you can control them. Why? The number of folks that we've met with where there's an overconfidence bias that assumes that because we've got this expertise and 20 years of clinical experience, we don't need the regulatory support. It makes them die a little bit inside because they're missing opportunities to get the feedback that they need, because they're being susceptible to cognitive biases that they carry. So on that note,
We're kind of wrapped. He's telling us. I will say we didn't get to do questions, and I'm really sorry. So do we have time?
Do we?
Yeah, we do. I was going to say, and please, if anybody has to go or anybody that's on the Zoom, reach out to us. I will. I'm going to do.
Yeah, the last side that has our email would be kind of, yeah.
There you go. Please reach out to us, ask any questions and such, please. We're happy to answer those, and we actually do respond. But at this point, the key takeaways are everything we talked about. Start early, start very, very early and get some good guidance and advice. To the buy piece, there's so many times somebody said, we need to figure out how to prototype, but my uncle works in a brick manufacturing shop, so he can help. And you're going, oh my goodness, I'm so happy he works there. He doesn't know how to apply power. He doesn't know how to whatever. So, and it's always, you know what, it's okay. My brother works in an ICU. He's told us we don't have to work on regulatory yet. I'm so glad he's got the job in the ICU. Please don't ask him for regulatory advice. And great people out there, but make sure they have the experience for what you're asking for. So,
And if you don't have to leave, if we can stay 15 minutes, if you all have questions that you want to ask, we can add another 15 minutes. Anybody?
any questions?
Any questions? Yes, sir.
Does breakthrough designation preclude use of a predicate device?
No, it does. That's a great question. It does not. You can still pursue substantial equivalence. But I love that question so much. How you end up positioning it for breakthrough is specific to the fact that it will enable a benefit to that subpopulation that is not currently getting it. Everything else can still be the same. Yes, you can.
Okay.
It doesn't keep you from doing that. And Mark, I had that on the list actually that I talked to Rick about for some of the things on your end for yours. You're really cool.
We also have a question. If not, I have a follow-on.
Sure.
So, go ahead, please.
At least for medical devices, it seems like the conversation is usually predicated around getting like intellectual property, but what happens if you're more focused on like an open source approach for a medical device? I'm curious as to like what implementations have you seen to that, and what kind of like complication usually comes with that if you're trying to bring like a device to market that's open source.
So from that perspective, your goal is to be able to come up with something that can be used and adopted how? So the plan is to have it, you come up with it, you'll validate that it's a safe API to use, and then you want to be able to have institutions. Tell me more. What's the goal there? Because if it's
For like my specific case.
Yeah. You don't have to tell me exactly what, but we talking soft, because anytime it's generally software idea that.
It's both software and hardware. It's for an open source like CPAP machine.
Okay.
Because the technology is actually, I guess, relatively simple in terms of like what it uses and such. It's just that the prices are usually hiked pretty high, and like usually to even get these devices, you need to go through a bunch of like, well, you need to get a prescription first for a CPAP device. So and it's usually really expensive. So I'm trying to do an open source approach. So people that don't have insurance or can't even afford these devices can like acquire them easier. I guess that's my kind of idea.
I love that so much. I want you to think about enabling as many people to having it get to as many people as possible. You're still going to need a company that can manufacture it and manufacture it safely from a quality perspective. And all companies, even the ones that charge 4 times as much for a CPAP machine, look for lower cost alternatives for specific markets. Medtronic does that all the time. If you look at their portfolios, they will have a higher, like a differentiated product within their portfolio, and there'll be another acquisition for a much lower cost alternative for specific sites, for specific regions, for specific industries. So where do you run into problems with just doing it open source like that? You don't. You can go through and pull up the validations and the performance requirements, and you can get those executed and have FDA approve it. But I want you to really think about the importance of tying that into an actual company that can get that lower cost device distributed, because congratulations, you've got the approval. You don't have a foothold to get it to all of those poor people that need it. You don't have sales reps, you don't have distribution channels, you don't have a floor to go from there. That piece is really, really important for what you're trying to do. Any other questions? Yes.
Didn't hear you say that for predicate devices, you can find all of their required testing and data somewhere on either through the FDA. Is that something that can be easily acquired? So let's say you want to compare your technology to some other device.
You can't get access, but so from it, when he says there's a SSED that has to be posted, and so what they'll do is they'll say, we did this testing, high level, you're not gonna get, because of the IP, and they're not gonna get access to the technical details for how they performed. That said, everybody publishes ORS. So if somebody did a biocompatibility or biomechanical testing, and for them, in a lot of cases, especially in orthopedics, they're doing substantial, we're doing substantial equivalence 24/7. They'll do that test for the FDA requirement. They'll turn around and present it at ORS, we'll turn around and publish it. So it's the exact same data.
So matching their test methodology is.
It's a good way to, I don't think it's a bad idea. Be careful not to do, this is important though. You can't make promotional claims that say they published X where their results were this in their test. And when we ran the same test, we published Y. There's a requirement for you have to do them in the same study. So if you're going to do a side-by-side comparison, you don't get to take a historical publication and say their efficacy rates were X and ours were Y. FDA forces you to say, right, double down and pay that you're going to do theirs and yours, and good luck getting samples from the competitor to run that comparison. Yeah.
You need to actually acquire the other companies. Whatever you're comparing it to, you have to acquire. the
Yeah,
other.
there are, let's have a chat. There are compliant ways to do that, leveraging your academic institutions from that perspective and having it be perfectly legal and on the books.
And testing can be done in-house. You don't have to have it done independently.
No, it doesn't have to be a third party. No, you have to follow, it does a great question. It doesn't have to be done third party. You want to be able to use it and not get in trouble. There are GLP requirements that have to be followed with SOPs, and that lab has to be certified against specific standards for you to be able to use that data and speak to it from a promotional claims perspective. It can't just be done in somebody's back lab. That lab itself has to meet specific requirements. What else?
Mark, you had a follow on. I did, and also relates to predicate devices. What if is there such a thing as a partial predicate device that covers some aspects of your invention, but not all?
We have, so you can do a primary and a secondary. They get really irritated beyond that. You can't say, hey, our device is these other 4 devices. Is the response. So can I go with it depends? Because honestly, it depends, but they don't do well with you trying to sell substantial equivalence when it really isn't equivalence, because it's not equivalence to a device. You've taken 3 or 4 things and come up with something new. From that perspective.
But if it's a little bit like grant writing, rule 1 is don't piss off the reviewers.
Yeah, rule 1, yeah. Well, just it's less don't piss off the reviewers and more speak their language. If you speak their language, you're okay. And I'm telling you, that's the other piece, that there's this base case assumption of a lot of startups. We're just going to copy paste. We're going to look at the predicates and do exactly what they did, not realizing that there are really small things that can screw you in the worst way with certain comments or statements that you make, not recognizing who the reviewers are. Somebody that's been working with that reviewer for 15 years is going to be able to say, hey, things you want to be really careful about with that guy. He is obsessed with biocompatibility. Things you want to kind of watch out for. He's going to look at a microscope at the following testing. So you want to make sure that that's on lock. You don't get that kind of feedback pulling up that document or that PDF off the internet. It matters, and it can accelerate your timelines drastically from that perspective. That was fun. Thank you guys very, very much for listening.